be very simple to vote.
These laws serve only one purpose, to make it more difficult for people to vote, and I hope most Americans will see that and do something about it.
A coalition of conscience must be developed, a national effort to put as much pressure on these states, on the governors, the state legislatures, that said this will not be tolerated in our society. We must create a movement similar to the civil rights movement of the 60s. People must protest, must organize the unorganized, mobilize those that need to be mobilized, and say, this must go. It's the only way that we're going to stop it, and we must stop it.
Michael Schor will join us with more later in the show, but first, joining us to talk voter suppression and some of the issues we've already seen at the polls, Congresswoman Sjlee, Democrat of Texas. Congresswoman, as always, thank you for joining our show.
Elliot, thank you so much. A pleasure to be with you this evening.
Now, you had a rally today about voter suppression, and tell us why, what the issues still are, and where you see this issue. We've had some successes in the courts, but tell us how you think this issue has played out over the past several months.
Well, thank goodness we've had some victories, and those victories will play out in our elections or our election on the final election day, the election day tomorrow, November 6th. For example, Ohio just went to court to insist on these last 2 days of early vote, Saturday and Sunday, and I just came back from Ohio with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, and our emphasis was one vote, one person, your vote is precious, but the idea of how exciting it was to see people be able to vote this past Saturday and Sunday. And I think the point should be made, to vote is not to commit fraud. To vote is not to commit a felony. That's what we want to step away from. And that was the inference of these laws. In fact, I am in a state that, along with Wisconsin, Texas, and one other state, had the most repressive, if you will, voter ID laws. Fortunately, we won the battle. And here is the message that we had today. Our message was very calm. It was very simple. It said that the right to vote is precious, and we should protect the right to vote. And when I spoke, Governor, I was speaking to all of Harris County. You know, this is one of the counties that the U.S. Department of Justice has sent monitors in because we've had a history of intimidation. But I did not want to divide the community in my remarks today. And what I said is that everyone that votes tomorrow should rule. We should not have any instance of whether you're disabled or a senior, whether you are one that has not voted before, whether you have a language issue, nothing should block your right to vote. And I mean that whether you live on the east, the west, the south, or the north. We must say to America that the right to vote is precious. And as my colleague said, we've got to organize around this. We are overwhelmed by blocks to voting. And it stops people from voting. It frightens people from voting. And I think we have to get away from that to keep the ideals of this Constitution and what we were founded on is that we were all created equal.
You are so right in your articulation of this as a fundamental civil rights issue, a notion that goes to the very core of our democracy. I think the good news is that over the past number of months, what I don't hesitate to say was a clear Republican effort to suppress votes among minority voters, seniors, those whom they viewed to be adverse to their agenda. That effort has failed because the courts have done what the courts have done historically in this nation. They've stepped in to protect fundamental civil rights. And I think that has been one of the great successful storylines already of this election season. But as a consequence of that, I think what we're seeing now, Congresswoman, and I want to get your view on this, is another form of voter suppression, which is the same Republican governors not permitting the ballot box to be open, not permitting the resources to be there, which is why already in Florida we've seen a voting line of 7 hours, which is a different form, a sort of a mechanical way of keeping people from voting. How do we confront that?
You know, that is a number one, I think, civil rights question for members of Congress. You know, the call for bipartisanship, Elliot, should really ring loudly, and that should be around voting. Because if I give a person in Florida the right to vote, then I will likewise give the person in red states, blue states, and purple states the right to vote. If Republicans can come to the acknowledgement that we live under one flag, that when soldiers leave our shore and go to battlegrounds, they fight for one flag and one democracy. We could fix these antiquated voting rules, or we could get our governors, no matter what their party affiliation, to recognize that the voter rules on that day. You're absolutely right. I've had lines here that the last day of early vote, there were people online here in Texas, in Harris County, till 10:30 at night. Well, thank goodness for those voters who felt that their vote was important enough to stay there. But this is not a way to treat a tax-paying American citizen who's blessed by this flag and democracy. We need more financial resources. We need same-day registration and the ability to vote on the same day that you register. Why should you be intimidated or diminished in your right to vote if you are an American citizen who's willing to fight on foreign soil, you paid your taxes, you're committed to this country, and yet there are blocks to you voting? So I would argue that we need a complete reform of the election system. Yep. We need to be able to ensure that we use technology, online voting. We need to make sure that our machines are accurate. We've had problems with machines losing votes, not allowing people to vote, showing names, Elliot, that are not the names that people voted for. So we have come together as Democrats with a major election reform bill introduced by our leader, the minority whip, which is Mr. Hoyer, and supported by our leader, Nancy Pelosi, and all of the leadership. We seek a bipartisan effort behind that. And the message of this election reform bill, it's an extensive bill. It wants to give resources to the state, but more importantly, it has as its emphasis and its premise that voters rule and voters should not be blocked by some form of suppression in their right to vote.
Congresswoman, you are so right. In the aftermath of 2000, it seems like ancient history now. When I was Attorney General, we did a study in New York, came up with a litany of proposals, many of which you just articulated, tried to make it a bipartisan effort. Unfortunately, as you just said, every one of these efforts, which goes simply to the core notion of voting as a civil right, gets caught up in the mire of partisanship. It's a real shame. We've got to overcome it because the fundamental notion of our democracy is at stake. Anyway, our time is run. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Just one quick note, Governor,
yes,
just to thank the governor of New York, and I know that if you were there, you do the same thing, and I think people should know that, to allow an affidavit to let those people who have been harmed or in harm's way with Sandy to vote in any precinct they can find by way of affidavit. Wouldn't that be nice on Election Day to let people go identify themselves and vote in any voting place across America, meaning in their particular state? Right. That's what we're talking about with voter opportunity.
Yep. As you said, with same-day registration, there are ways to do it with technology that would prevent fraud. Fraud is the great bugaboo false issue they raise. Anyway, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, thank you so much, as always, for your participation in our programs over the course of the past months.